Welcome, everyone. Good evening. My name is Michele Storms. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Executive Director at the ACLU of Washington. I'm excited to welcome you to a special election season Flights and Rights. And oh, what a special election season it is. So we started the week with Indigenous Peoples Day. On that day and each day, we remember the first people. They are still here, and justice is still overdue. I'm speaking from the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Coast Salish people, who have stewarded this land for generations. We honor them by remembering the role our country played in stripping them of their land, culture, and language, and recognizing that there is so much more work we need to do to make this country fair for Indigenous people and for all people. On Monday, we sponsored KEXP's day-long programming honoring Indigenous Peoples Day. KEXP is an important partner of ours for Flights and Rights. Our Flights and Rights events are typically hosted in breweries and event spaces around the state, most often the gathering space of KEXP 90.3 FM and KEXP.org. KEXP DJ Eva Walker of the Blacktones has put together a playlist especially for tonight. Please check the chat box for details. And that's not all. For the first time since we've been virtual, we have a partner brewery tonight. Now, this is only going to impact the Seattle folks, but you can visit the Lucky Envelope Brewing Company and grab yourself a beer for $5 off by mentioning the ACLU this evening. They're open until 9, so you have time to go after we talk election. We haven't forgotten about our friends outside of Seattle. As long as we're continuing to do these events virtually, we will partner with breweries all over Washington so that all of you can have the chance to share. Also tonight, everyone in attendance has been entered into an ACLU of Washington Supreme Swag giveaway. We'll draw winners later tonight and notify 3 winners by email tomorrow. So between the giveaway, the lucky envelope, and the KEXP DJ set, I'm thrilled that this Flights and Rights is as close as it gets to the real deal. Okay, so now tonight's program. Tonight we're talking election. It's just a couple of weeks away, and specifically what the election means for us here in Washington as ballots are beginning to drop. We have some good things happening here in our state. As you know, Washington is a vote by mail state, which feels more significant now than ever as we fight to make this as an option for voters all around the country. This shouldn't have to be a fight. Here in Washington, this is also the first general election in which the state's Native American Voting Rights Act is in effect. This act allows for non-traditional addresses on tribal land to be used for registration. Reservations can also request to have ballot boxes placed on their land. Now, for as much progress as we make, we're hearing more questions than answers. Will my vote count? What if I have a criminal record? Why should I bother to vote down the ballot? Our speakers tonight will help to answer these questions. Let me tell you who they are. So first, we'll hear from Breanne Schuster, ACLU Washington staff attorney. Prior to joining us in 2015, Breanne attended the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Prior to joining us in 2015, Breanne attended the University of Wisconsin-Madison, spent a year working and learning French in Brussels, and graduated from the Seattle University School of Law. During law school, Breanne served as executive editor for the Seattle Journal for Social Justice and volunteered with the Homeless Rights Advocacy Project. She also interned with the ACLU of Washington, worked with the Alliance for a Just Society, Disability Rights Washington, and public defender organizations. Our next speaker will be Jen Cole. Jen is the parent of a 10-year-old with disabilities and served on the OSPI, Office for Superintendent of Public Instruction, Sexual Health Education Work Group. The work group provided 2 reports to the State Board of Education, Department of Health, and the education committees of the legislature. Jen also serves as director of the Parent Training and Information Program at the Partnerships for Action Voices for Empowerment. Last, but definitely not least, Leah Rutman will speak. Leah is the ACLU of Washington Healthcare and Liberty Counsel. Prior to joining the ACLU in 2013, Leah practiced commercial litigation at an international law firm and worked and volunteered at various human rights organizations. Leah is a graduate of McGill University and Columbia University School of Law. So as usual, we'll go through all of our speakers and then we'll be in dialogue together. You can put your questions in the chat box at any time and I'll be picking those up. Thank you so much for being here, and let's get started with Breanne.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you all for being here. I'll try to keep, I know we have a lot of great conversation to be had, so I'll keep this introduction short and sweet. Voting rights has been such a critical part of the ACLU's work long before this election, and I know it will be long after. We've been working to combat voter suppression and voter dilution in a variety of ways, whether it's bringing litigation when we need to protect people's rights, advancing legislation and doing policy advocacy, both at a statewide level and at local levels through the county and through the city and through school boards, as well as engaging in a lot of public education. So making sure that people know, as Michelle alluded to, and we'll talk a little bit more about, who has the right to vote, what do you need to do to register, how do you register, when do you need to register, and making sure that people have the information they need to access the ballot. We've also been working a lot with communities to understand and hear the issues that they're facing and what we need to be tackling. And we're going to be continuing to monitor what's happening, both with this election, but beyond that, with people's rights, to ensure that everyone who is an eligible voter has that voice, and to advance the rights of those who are still not able to vote.
Thank you, Breanne. So I'm excited to talk to you about Referendum 90. Referendum 90 is on the ballot, and that is my son talking. This is the life right now for a lot of Washingtonian parents. So Referendum 90 is a sex education in public schools measure. So a vote to approve Referendum 90 would support Senate Bill 5395 to take effect, thereby requiring public schools to provide comprehensive sexual health education for all students, and requiring students to be excused by their parents if so requested. And a vote to reject Referendum 90 opposes allowing the bill to take effect, thereby not requiring public schools provide comprehensive sexual health education. This is a really important issue, and it gets talked about a lot in circles, and it's really important that there is accurate information out there regarding the referendum. And I'm just part of a large coalition, PAVE and many other organizations that support and endorse approving Referendum 90, so that all students in Washington state could have access to comprehensive sexual health education, thereby helping them be safe and make informed decisions regarding their future. Thank you.
Hi, so as Michelle said, my name is Leah Rutman, and I'm the Healthcare and Liberty Counsel at the ACLU. Healthcare work is really core to what the ACLU does, especially in the areas of health equity, reproductive health, end of life, and LGBTQ care. Right now, healthcare has such an important role in what everyone is interested in the world, really, because of the coronavirus. This pandemic has laid bare both the crucial importance of our healthcare systems and the racial inequities that exist and exacerbate harm to marginalized communities, including in access and delivery of care. So tonight, I'm excited to talk a bit about how these elections will have significant ramifications on access to healthcare in Washington state. Thanks.
Thanks so much to each of you for just giving us a general background on what it is that you've been working on and how that's relevant to this conversation about elections right now. So I'm going to kind of zoom back a little bit and actually start with Breanne, because I had referenced earlier that Washington's been a universal vote by mail state for a long time. You don't have to request a ballot. If you're registered to vote, you're going to get a ballot, right? So that's great. And nationwide, this is really a big issue right now, because we have states that are rejecting the idea of having vote by mail, claiming that that's going to be fraudulent. and it's getting people kind of scared. So I'm wondering if you can share some information about how it's worked in Washington, what we know about from studies about the potential for fraud and those sorts of things. Talk about the safety of voting by mail.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it is interesting. I mean, it's great that so many states, are now considering vote by mail. But I think what's been getting lost a lot in this conversation, and not this particular conversation, but in a lot of the rhetoric, is that a lot of states, in fact, the majority of states, right, have actually had vote by mail in some capacity, right? If you're a military person overseas, if you're a student that doesn't have a permanent address yet, if you're in the hospital and you're sick and you still want to be voting. And so all of those principles should still apply here. You shouldn't have to be choosing between your livelihood or your well-being and your health and your voice. We in Washington, as you mentioned, Michele, have had mail by voting. Actually, since the 90s, the majority of counties were using mail by voting. And then in 2011, we switched entirely to mail by voting, with the exception, of course, there's if you can't mail in your ballot, there are both ways to drop it in a drop box, and you have an ability to vote in person if you need to. And we haven't seen really any evidence, neither in Washington nor in any other state that uses vote by mail ballots only, of fraud. So I think they did a study of Washington in 2018, or of the 2016 and 2018 elections, and I think it was less than like 0.003% of ballots showed, and that was just showed potential evidence of fraud, right? It wasn't even like proof that this person voted twice or voted from the wrong address or something like that. Similarly, in Oregon, which has been using mail by voting since I think the year 2000, they've only documented out of more than 100 million ballots, maybe a dozen cases that have been proven of fraud. So it's very, very low percentage. And all the more critical right now, it's especially critical right now during the pandemic, but mail-in voting offers so many other benefits, even outside of COVID-19, right? I know when I used to live in Wisconsin, and we had in-person voting only, minus absentee, and it was really a challenge to get to the polling place, as I am sure a lot of people can appreciate. If you're working, if you have kids, and you're not able to get time off for that, or be able to get paid for that time. And so it's a great way, and it's a great thing for states to have access to and for people to have access to. So here we, like I said, have had it since 2011, haven't really had any issues. One thing I would encourage folks to do if you are living in Washington is to vote early. And you're able to track your ballot. You have a slip on the ballot, as many people probably are aware, but just in case, to both make sure that it gets delivered, and if there's any issues with like your signature or otherwise, you can find out and make sure you can request a new ballot in time. And we also have drop boxes in every county. And so if you're feeling a little bit nervous about using the mail right now, I think there's less risk because Washington State has been using the vote by mail system for so long, and the Secretary of State here has a really good relationship with the Postal Service, and they're not incredibly concerned about vote by mail, but certainly there's, that doesn't mean that there isn't reason to be wary. So there's drop boxes, and just get that ballot in as early as you can.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. And it's funny because I have always seen that strip about tracking your ballot. I've never done it. I'm probably going to do it this year for the first time just to see. But it's great to remind people about that because so much safety and security has been built into our system in Washington. And I really would hope that could be kind of a model for people to know that, we can do this. We can do this. So I think I want to turn next to Leah, and there's a lot of things that we vote for, and we're definitely going to come to R90, Jen, so hold on, be ready. But there's a lot of things to vote for, and I think one of the other things that's really important about voting is getting an understanding of the positions of lawmakers who you're voting for. And so I'm just wondering, from your perspective, certainly with the work that you've been doing, what are some of the ways that you can check that out and get a sense of what your lawmakers are voting for, or what positions they're taking, and what are some of the things coming up in our legislature this next session that we should be alert to.
Sure, thanks, Michelle. So in terms of how to be aware of what your lawmakers are interested, care about, I mean, obviously check their websites, get on their mailing lists. Also, frankly, check the internet, because what they're not going to tell you sometimes is their voting records. If they've previously made statements or voted in some ways that are public, you can check that out and understand, where they really come down on some of these issues. And I just think it's so important to know, because they really do have a lot of influence and a lot of power in what happens to all of us in Washington state. I'll talk a little bit about some of the issues relating to healthcare that we see will likely come up this legislative session, but it really runs the gamut of all issues, right? In the healthcare context, one thing I'd mention is healthcare coverage for marginalized communities, including undocumented individuals. So this is definitely a top priority for the ACLU and something we expect to see this legislative session. Very briefly, the United States does a pretty bad job of ensuring people have access to healthcare in Washington, in the whole country, and definitely a pretty bad job when it comes to equitable access. People of color are more likely to be uninsured, face challenges in accessing healthcare, and undocumented individuals have even more hurdles to overcome because they're excluded from things like Medicaid. They're also excluded from the healthcare exchange subsidies. So they either have health coverage through their employer, or it's really prohibitively expensive. So we expect this to come up this session, in part because healthcare is such a big issue right now. And now more than ever, people understand that keeping one person healthy literally can keep entire communities healthy. What you need, though, to make this happen is lawmakers who understand this issue and care about it. The one other healthcare issue I just wanted to touch upon is healthcare relating to the intersection of religion. We see this a lot in Washington state, and we really need laws that ensure religion can't be used as a tool to discriminate or harm others, including when they're trying to access healthcare, such as when a woman is miscarrying and goes to a religious health system and refused or delayed care, putting her life or health at risk. We expect to see legislation this year relating to that and relating to religious secular health system affiliations and what happens when patients are denied care. But again, the ability to move forward with that work and the ability to protect Washingtonians really rests on who we elect and whether they're supportive of the things we believe in.
Thanks so much. That's a great preview and window into some of the things we can expect. And you kind of left off on, the legislators and those who do the things that we care about. And that is really a great segue into R90, because I certainly know many people who were surprised to find out that before the last legislative session, we didn't have comprehensive, inclusive, age-appropriate sex education for students in Washington state. And so then the legislators passed this law. Many of us were very excited about it, but now there's this referendum. So I want to start, Jen, with you telling a little bit more about what the path was, how we got this landmark law passed, and then what this referendum process means for our ability for our kids to be educated about their health and their bodies.
Yes, absolutely. And, from my perspective, my piece in this is coming on board as a parent who served on the work group for OSPI. We looked at the data, we looked at the current laws, and it was just surprising that our state hasn't tackled this issue sooner. I think our state has tried in the past, and so we were at this pivotal point as a diverse stakeholder group to look at the information and make our recommendations. And so we did that. And, as a parent, this also has a lot of personal meaning for me. When Leah was talking about, equitable access to healthcare, I mean, this is connected. These issues do connect, and equitable access to information that is often life-changing for individuals who experience things such as sexual violence or sexual abuse. So, you know, and as you mentioned, Michele, while this bill did pass and Governor Inslee signed this in March of 2020, there were opponents to the bill that collected enough signatures to put it on the ballot for November as a reject. So, you know, as I'm coming to it today, I'm talking, you know, as a Washingtonian, as a parent who really cares about equitable access to information for our young people. For our young people to have information that is medically and scientifically accurate, information that is inclusive, so inclusive of identity, and that does include our youth who identify as LGBTQ. That is also teaches affirmative consent. We did not have that as part of our past bills that required a teaching about what is affirmative consent. Young people need to know that. And then, you know, also it does provide the option for families to work in their communities, because it's a local thing that gets adopted with their local school board to make the decision about what curriculum gets applied, and ultimately a parent who decides if they want their child to participate or not. And also, you know, I just want to point out that there's elements to the bill, the legislation that does require a piece about teaching what healthy relationships look like. It's developmental, of course, very, you know, age appropriate, again, age appropriate, and takes our Washingtonian youth from, you know, childhood into when they graduate from high school, prepared to make informed decisions, to make decisions that protect them from sexual abuse, violence, unintended pregnancy, and, you know, most definitely sexually transmitted infections. So that's why it's important, and we are in a position to make sure that all our youth have access, at least at a minimum, to the information. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. And, you know, if you don't mind, I want to follow up on something, because something that you said reminded me of some of the literature I had seen from the Reject R90. And you were talking about from the entire like K through 12 experience, right? And, you know, there were some things that were getting said about what was going to get taught to kindergartners. And what I heard said was actually pretty alarming, but I also knew it wasn't true. So I would love if you could elaborate a little bit on what it means to provide, you know, comprehensive medically, you know, like what's happening at sort of like the K-2, K-3 level, to just allay people's concerns that somehow we're, you know, teaching kindergartners about, you know, condoms or something. So can you speak to that?
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, as a parent myself, I mean, I wouldn't want my child to have that kind of information provided in front of him. Really, the early grades are about social emotional learning. It's about things, you know, related to Aaron's Law, actually, that's connected to the prevention of childhood sexual abuse. It's, you know, about standards that align with our current health education standards in Washington State. And I have such great confidence in our Washingtonian educators that I just, it blows my mind to think that, you know, a kindergarten teacher would be teaching something inappropriate, like that's not developmentally appropriate for our youth. So it is, you know, developmental. It has an ongoing conversation that takes that youth right into adolescence to have, you know, more focused conversations about, you know, sexual health. But of course, it's, you know, early grades, it's mostly about social emotional learning.
So in that social emotional learning space, it's really like, you know, something makes you uncomfortable. What do you do? Or how do you, you know, react to things like that? Yeah.
Of course, yes.
No, that's really great. I appreciate you saying that. We'll probably come back and talk a little bit more about it, but I wanted to zoom out a little on something else, because for Breanne, the other like protections related to voting that Washington voters should know about, and what to do when you don't have a traditional address. And just sort of exploring a little bit more of those things so that people can have confidence that they really do have the ability to vote.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll kind of highlight some of the biggest questions or most, I guess, popular, frequently asked questions that I get. But I certainly hope that if folks have more, we can address those too. So one of the questions I get a lot is the one that you touched upon, Michele. Can I vote without a traditional address? And yes, you absolutely can. And so really, you just need a place that you can get your ballot. So you have to provide, when you register to vote, 2 addresses, and one is to figure out like who's your representative, right? So what district or what precinct are you in? And that's, you can put a intersection of a street, you can put, a kind of a landmark. It doesn't really matter. It's mostly just to figure out where, like who's representing your interests and ensuring that those 2 things are aligned. And then you need to have a mailing address as well that you can receive mail. And that can be, if you're houseless, it can be a shelter, it can be a friend's house. If you live on a reservation or tribal land, it can be a building or a non-traditional address. And a couple of those things, as you also mentioned, Michele, are thanks to the great protections that came out of the Native American Voting Rights Act last session. But and of course, we still have work to do on that, but you can absolutely vote without a quote unquote traditional address. Another question that I get a lot and that comes up is, can I vote without an ID? And you absolutely can in Washington. You do not need a driver's license and you do not need an official government ID. And we have information on the types of other verification that you can provide both on our website and the Secretary of State's website. And it's a pretty long list, so I won't go through in detail all of them, but basically you just need to prove that you live where you say you live. And there's a number of different documents that can suffice to show that. Another question that I get a lot that people should really know about is whether you can vote. Both of you have a felony conviction or another type of conviction on your record. And the question is, it depends. If you have just a misdemeanor or you don't have a felony, but you're in jail or otherwise incarcerated, you can still vote. So the only type of conviction in Washington state that would impact your right to vote is a felony conviction in adult court. And so prior to conviction, prior to your trial, whether, if you have a misdemeanor, if you have a juvenile conviction, you can still vote, and you can do that even if you're incarcerated. And so we've been working really hard to make sure that that's a reality. Just because you have the right, making sure that actually is happening in practice. And please do, if any of these things become an issue, contact us and let us know for you. If you have a felony conviction, the current state of the law in Washington is you are able to vote once you're no longer incarcerated and under DOC supervision. And so if you're under community custody, which is sort of Washington's version of parole, then you're not allowed to vote until that's done. But we're hoping to change that, and we'll talk a little bit about why later. But those are some of, I think, the important kind of myths and misconceptions I hear most commonly.
Thanks.
Oh, and wait, sorry, one more.
You got it.
You can register the same day as the election. And so that's also a new law that just passed in the last couple of years. And so if you can register to vote and you can vote on the same day. You have to do it in person, but you can register up to 8 days before the election and same day in person. So
another one of my favorite Washington state voting improvements, and I think this passed in the legislature maybe 2 or 3 years ago, was pre-registration for 16-year-olds, right? So
absolutely.
Right, because young people have opinions, they have a voice, we want them to be educated. And apparently there's some indication that the younger people start thinking about voting, the more educated they tend to be about the issues. Hopefully I'm not making that up. I'm pretty sure I read that. So, that's just, I think that's a wonderful thing that we offer. And it's a pre-registration, right? You don't actually get to vote till you're 18, but it kind of just gets you in the pipeline. And I think that's really positive. So Leah, understandably, it being 2020 and a presidential election year, people are thinking about the big picture in the federal arena, the presidential race, the Supreme Court nominations. Could you speak a little bit about kind of the intersection between the importance of, the intersection between what happens in the federal arena and that importance to their state elections, how some of that all ties together?
Yeah, I find that topic fascinating, maybe because I'm a nerdy lawyer, but nonetheless, I think the easiest way to really think about it in the healthcare context, a way that makes it crystal clear, is when we think about the Supreme Court nomination and this ongoing conversation about Roe versus Wade, right? The law that essentially identified the constitutional right to abortion. You hear over and over again in the media from our president that the Supreme Court, nominee will want to overturn Roe versus Wade, that it will no longer exist. And overturning Roe versus Wade could have catastrophic impacts on some communities in this country and some states. The consequences in our state are very different. And that is because of a state law that was actually approved by voter initiative. So it's an initiative process, kind of similar to a referendum process, back in 1991 that established a fundamental right to abortion. So even if Roe versus Wade is gone, and I very truly hope it is not, and it would be very problematic, but in Washington state, Washingtonians would still have a fundamental right to abortion, which is wonderful, except that it's a state law. And so the ability for that state law to be maintained is completely dependent on who we elect, because almost every single year, there are lawmakers who drop a bill that are trying to basically get rid of that law, change that law so that there would not be a fundamental right to abortion in Washington state and that people could not access abortion. The reason it does not move anywhere is because there are not enough lawmakers who support that, right? So who we vote for in Washington state absolutely intersects with what's going on in the federal arena, because it's really, you have to look at both the federal arena and the state arena together to understand what your rights are and what you can and cannot access.
Thank you, Leah. Well, that made that really plain, and it is important. And, presidential election years are years when more people tend to vote, right? Voter turnout is higher. This year, that's all complicated by COVID and all the barriers that are have been erected to voting. But what you've shared just really emphasizes how critical it is to actually vote, right? And so the mantra right now is, what is everybody saying? Have a plan to vote. When are you going to do it? How are you going to do it? What are you going to do with your ballot, right? Everyone should be thinking about that. I want to come back to R90 for a moment, Jen, because there was something that I wanted to make sure that people understood about it. You talked about what the law will do, or what the law that has passed should do. And one of the things that I think might be good to address is what's at stake if the referendum is rejected. So what was the state of our law on sex education for kids before, and what were the implications of that? What ends up happening if we don't win this one?
Well, Michele, like you mentioned earlier, like we didn't have anything that required public schools to teach this information. And so, public schools in their local districts, they could choose a variety of ways to just get at the bare minimum of teaching youth about maybe things related to HIV, some things related to how your body changes and whatnot. And so when, as a member of the work group, when I looked at the data, it was just very clear to me what the consequences are and what the consequences will continue to be for our youth who don't have access to this information. And that includes, poor health outcomes for youth of color, for those who identify as female, those who identify as LGBTQ. And, if I'm bringing in my experience with disability, we have a really poor track record in our state of inclusion of students with disabilities in the general education setting. So, you know, right now, about 57% of our students access general education 80 to 100% of the day. For students of color, that drops to approximately 47%. And then for those with intellectual or developmental disability, that plummets to 5% or less. And so, you know, access to information has consequences, and we see this play out, especially with COVID, how our communities pay the price when they don't have access to information, so they can make decisions and also have access to resources to you know, address their needs as well. So I think the consequences, we will just continue to see groups of youth who consistently pay the price for lack of access to information, and you know, we'll miss a pivotal moment to really think about inclusive education, especially when it comes to our LGBTQ youth, to see themselves reflected in curriculum that has a lot of meaning for them, for sure. So yeah, I think that's what's at risk if we don't approve 90.
Thank you so much for that. And Leah, if you don't mind me picking on you about this, because I remember I heard you sharing some information before related to R90, and you had given a couple specific examples of things that we've heard about at the ACLU that people were attempting to teach in schools and pass off as sex education that were a little horrifying. So if you remember a couple of those examples, it'd be great to hear it. And if you don't, I apologize. I know I'm springing this one on you. So
Sorry, had to get off mute, but yes, happy to share that. And as Michele said, the ACLU has an intake line, and we also work with a lot of our allies. And so from time to time, we would hear stories about sex education in Washington State that was horrifying, frankly. A few examples that I'll share, and I probably don't remember all the examples offhand, but one of them that was brought to us was about a crisis pregnancy center, which are centers that often provide inaccurate information about sex and abortion, had been brought into a school to provide sex education. And apparently one of the instructors, you know, was chewing gum, spit it out, and then told the female participants in the classroom that basically that's what they would be if they had sex before marriage. Similarly, there was a story about someone coming into the school to teach about sex ed and asking only the female students to sign a pledge, essentially not to have sex before marriage, and similar incidences to that. So really horrifying, problematic things when we don't ensure that there's comprehensive sex education throughout our state.
Yes, so we don't want to go back to those days. So I think that's one of the reasons why we've really been involved in wanting to share information about this referendum and just how important it is. Breanne, I want to come back to you because you gave us a little cliffhanger a few minutes ago, a little tidbit about the work around felony disenfranchisement, and you kind of said what the state of the law is right now, and then you said, but we're working on it. So do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so, yeah, it's so great to get to present this in such like a holistic panel, because it really underscores, as Leah was saying, like the importance of who you elect, because they'll also set this law, right? So we're working on a piece of legislation, and we're really we're supporting incredible leaders that are really, you know, generating these policies. But to make it so currently the state of the law is that you can vote, as I mentioned, once you're out of community custody, DOC community custody. That right to vote is, as technically it's defined as provisional, or, you know, like that you could it implies you could somehow get it taken away again. And there's certain caveats in the current law and circumstances in which you technically could get it taken away. They haven't really been employed yet. And and which is just another reason to get rid of them, because if we're not using them, why do we have all these exemptions and exceptions and make it all complicated when it should just be really streamlined and simple? So what the law that we're trying to change is to make it so that people who they're working, they're living in the communities, they're contributing to our society, and just because they happen to be on DOC supervision doesn't mean that they shouldn't be able to vote. And so we're trying to change it so once you're no longer incarcerated, your right to vote is automatically restored, and that it is a permanent right. And that is, so it's not like you don't have to sit around and hope that somebody's going to wait for someone to take it away, or see, if there's so we're really excited about that, and to start dismantling some of these voting injustices that are really disproportionately impacting people of color in Washington state and across the country.
Your last little bit almost began to address it, but I think the question I'm thinking about, Breanne, is it's a little bit like what's at stake. And so what have been the barriers, right, to this or what's behind the disenfranchisement, and what are people worried about, and how do we get past that? Because yeah, I'll leave it there instead of answering it for myself.
I mean, go for it, please. Oh, there's so much at stake. And I think it's so, it seems sometimes so obvious, right, that our carceral system is so wrapped up in racism and systems of oppression, and that goes to when we disenfranchise people for getting involved in the criminal system. So many of these laws that we know about felony disenfranchisement were really born in a response to the emancipation of slaves and to Reconstruction. And so it was just another way to ensure that Black people, and particularly at that time, Black men, couldn't vote. And this happened in a couple of different ways. Both, a number of states started implementing laws that specifically were targeted at Black Americans. And then they subsequently wrote laws that said, you can't vote if you're convicted of this crime. And these were really, it was very intentional. It wasn't like one of those circumstances where you're like, oh, I mean, we see later after the fact that it disproportionately was impacting. No, these were intended to, and you can see in quotes from around that time across the country that the intent was really, really driven by white supremacy. And so it's long overdue to start undoing these laws, both in Washington and across the state, and start really providing justice that's rooted in anti-racism and that's rooted in making sure that everyone has the right to vote.
Right. And, one of the things that I think about is that voting is just so foundational to the idea of democracy and to who we mean to be as a country. And the carceral system, when you serve your time, that is meant to be your time is served. So to not allow a person to come back into society and participate is just highly problematic for me also, just from sort of a sense of what are we actually trying to do here? Punish forever and ever and ever. And so when I look at what happened in Florida, right, and Breanne, maybe you could speak to that a little bit, because it's so fascinating, because this tremendous grassroots movement to get that Amendment 4 passed to give people the right to vote, after their incarceration was ended. And then it ends up getting challenged in court, and they, the Supreme Court there, if I got this right, they made it so that, well, okay, but you can't do it if you have any legal financial obligations outstanding. And any of you folks who know anything about the way legal financial obligations work is that they're going to be outstanding for a long time because there's a lot of them and they just get piled on and on and on and on. So Breanne, I don't know if you want to say anything about that. And many people are attacking that as like a poll tax again. So going back to Jim Crow roots of our country and trying to prevent people from voting. So if you have anything to add to that, love to hear it.
Yeah, I don't know how much I have to add, because you said it so eloquently, but yeah, absolutely. It's requiring people to pay to vote, right? And that's not okay. That's not how democracy works. And it's such an affront to the spirit of democracy. And I will say, Washington, that used to be the case here too. In order to get your right to vote back, you had to pay all of your LFOs, and people recognized that that was really problematic, and that was really, contrary to the spirit of democracy. And I think, aside from all of those points, which really should be important and at the core of what we're thinking about, we know that it's good policy to let people vote. Right? It's really, we see better outcomes when folks are able to, after they've served their time, really fully integrate back into society and participate and vote and run for office and have a say in what's happening to them and their families and their communities. And so it's good for everyone.
Excuse me, my mouse was not cooperating with me. Yes, I so agree. And, that makes me think of something else, kind of hearkening back to this vote by mail controversy, right? Which is, it seems to me that we should make voting as accessible as possible. And so that, obviously it needs to be safe and secure, right? Like, we don't want there to be voter fraud. But when I think about sort of the old days in Washington, where literally you had, like, what was it, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. or something like that, and you'd had to go to usually some middle school somewhere and get lost in the halls trying to find the voting location. And so I love that we've prioritized making voting easy. I think, as we watch on the news right now, people who are just standing in lines, right, for hours and hours and hours. On one hand, it's really kind of disgusting and terrible. And on the other hand, there's like this spirit of democracy and engagement that you see people showing up and standing out there for so long. That's really very inspiring, even though it shouldn't have to be that way, right? I think it would be great, as we wrap up here, to hear from each of you, like, what you want to put out. And I'm actually going to start with you, Jen. What you want people to know, what you want people to do, and how people can help to move forward on the issues that you've been working on. So I really want to start with R90 and Jen and just hear what you want to offer up to the folks who are listening here today.
Thank you, Michele. And I just, I'm so grateful to have this conversation with you all this evening, because as much as R90 is its own ballot measure, it's all connected to everything that we discussed this evening. Because truly, no one should have to pay for the right to vote. People should have access to healthcare and their self-determination about what they're going to do with their bodies, for sure. And then how this connects to, our youth and keeping our youth in Washington safe and healthy. Because at the end of the day, for me as a parent, it won't be enough for Gabriel to have all the information in the world, because he actually needs a community to have this information too, to keep him healthy and safe. And I think it's really important, the ways people can lean in is to have these conversations about what it means to keep our youth in Washington safe and healthy, and really confront any misinformation that comes this way. As I'm watching more and more political ads, I'm just aware that there's a lot of misinformation about what this referendum is really about. And it's really about safe and healthy youth. And I think the last thing I forgot to mention was that, as part of the work group process, we did hear from youth. We heard from youth who came and talked to us about their experiences, their hopes and dreams for access to medically and scientifically accurate information, inclusive sexual health and education, and arming themselves with the tools they need to live healthy lives as adults. And so, the youth has spoken. It is a really important issue that at a minimum, students have access to the tools that they need. And it's all connected. We do have candidates who don't support this referendum to approve it. And so it's really important to ask the critical questions about that. So ways people can connect, in the chat, there's the website for Approve 90 Washington. Folks are welcome to just, visit the site, get more information, see the coalition of organizations that include the ACLU that are, endorse this important ballot measure, and, join the conversation. Let's keep our youth healthy and safe.
Thank you so much. That was so compelling. And I really felt just your care and concern as a human, as a parent, and as someone who has worked on this issue. So I'm really grateful for that. And yes, it's been put in the chat a couple of times. I know a question had come from the audience at one point. Is there a bullet pointed, sheet that we can look at? And it's all there on the website, and it's so well done and so very helpful. So thank you, Jen. Really appreciate you sharing that. Leah, I thought I would turn to you next, and just, from your perspective with the healthcare work, both on the sort of national level and absolutely on the state level, what are sort of your final parting shots here, and what do you hope that people will do or respond to?
Yeah, I'm glad that Jen went first, because really she made this easy for me, because I think there's so much intersection when it comes to R90, as she was saying about healthcare access and sharing information. I think, again, echoing Jen, look at what's happening on the ground so that you can vote for lawmakers who are going to solve the real problems, right? The same way R90 was talking to youth. When we work on issues relating to healthcare for immigrants, we go to the community and ask them, what are your healthcare needs? We talk to patients and providers to understand what they are or aren't able to access at health systems. And then you want lawmakers who are going to take those real live situations and solve real problems. The best way for you to be able to make those educated decisions is to educate yourself, right? Read the media, read the news. Maybe my issues are your issues. You want to hear more, so you want to sign up for the ACLU listservs. Maybe they're not, and there are other organizations you want to sign up to hear more about other issues. Whatever it is, just get really, really informed so that you can have the best information available to you when you make these decisions. Thanks.
Thanks, Leah. So, Breanne, you get the last word.
Ooh, no pressure. That's a tough act to follow. I hope vote early, vote often. No, I'm just kidding. Just vote one time, and contact us if you're hearing of any issues. And I know sometimes, as Leah kind of alluded to too, it can be overwhelming when you get your ballot to kind of track exactly what's on it and differentiating the candidates, and just know there are a lot of guides out there for you to help you through that. Again, depending on whatever issues are important to you, there is support out there for that. We have a lot of information on our website. The Secretary of State is a great website as well to refer to get information, and you can always contact your county officials. Many of them are really wonderful and have all of the information you need to. So vote and track your ballot.
And also fill out your census form if you haven't done
yes.
it yet. Right? Because that has an impact on the federal dollars that come into your community. It has an impact on who your electors are for presidential elections, and all of that. And of course, even though that is now 100% online, there have been different restrictions that have happened related to COVID. It's closing earlier than was expected. So please make sure that you do that. So yes, as has been put in the chat, demand to be counted. And also I would just say, every vote counts and every vote will be counted. And I think it's so important for people to, I want people to feel some faith in our system, because there's definitely been some efforts to sow seeds of doubt. This is who we are as a country, right? The ability to vote, the ability to participate. So absolutely, every vote counts, and we're going to make sure as the ACLU that every vote gets counted. And so there you go. All right, so we're going to make sure all the rest of the links get put in the chat for the census and everything else. And at this point, I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you to Breanne and to Jen and to Leah. And I want to thank you to all of our folks who have been tuned in today. It means so much to us that you come and join with us in community in this way, even virtually. It was always a lot of fun to be at KEXP or be, you know, at places in Kennewick and Spokane and Tacoma, all the different places that we got to go to. But knowing that you're with us and joining with us, even in this time of COVID, and even when a lot of us are on Zoom all day long, and maybe you don't want to watch another screen with a Brady Bunch layout, but you're here, and it matters so much to us to look down and see that the participants are here and that you're asking questions and that you care. So thank you, thank you, thank you for coming. So I want you to remember, if you're in Seattle, run out to Lucky Envelope Beer. You have 3 hours to do it before they close. In the chat box, let's put in DJ Eva Walker's playlist one more time so it's really close for everyone to see that. And then also, I just wanted to remind you that our centennial celebration is really soon. It's like a week away, or it's October 23rd. Is that next week? Because, you know, COVID time, it's so confusing with dates. If you haven't signed up, it's free, and we're really going to have a neat program. We're going to be giving some awards. We're going to have musical guests. Anthony Romero will be giving some remarks, our executive director of ACLU National. Depending on where you live, you can also purchase a dinner package or get a discounted dinner package. So check out ACLU-WA.org/celebrate, and hope to see you there. So that's it. Of course, I want to thank our behind the scenes folks at the ACLU who are bringing this to you. Again, thank you to our speakers. Have a great evening. Really a pleasure. Take care, everyone.